My name is Mariana. I welcome you all today as the co-organizer of this event, together with MeDiMi, who's so kind to take over the moderation in a second, after a very short introduction. Mina and I are researchers at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies here in Marburg, in a DFG-funded project on human rights crimes in the Syrian conflict and the implementation of universal jurisdiction principle in Germany. And we are part of a larger research group called MeDiMi, which looks at the dynamics of human rights discourses in migration societies from various disciplines. So what is this event trying to achieve today? When trying to understand how Syrians tackle the long history of impunity that has been hunting the Syrian conflict now for more than a decade, we cannot ignore taking a closer look at the Koblenz trials. Most of you might know these trials, which took place last year, had for the first time led to the conviction of 2 members of the Syrian regime in Germany in the higher regional court of Koblenz. Here, under the principle of universal jurisdiction, UNRWA and AFA have been sentenced for crimes against humanity. However, members of the Syrian diaspora in Germany, especially regime dissidents, have accompanied these trials in Koblenz with a series of protests, campaigns, art and media approaches. They were demanding this is not enough. Also, activists have pointed out the contradictory role that Germany and the EU have played throughout the horror of this conflict in the last decade. So provocatively asks, after all, is Germany now bringing justice to Syrians or what? That brings us to one of the questions of today's panel. How can justice for the Syrian people even look like or can be imagined? And how does the community itself discuss this cause? And this is why I am very happy to present today's panel as an attempt to open spaces for critical discussion beyond just academic research, together with practitioners and activists who have been involved in the struggles surrounding Koblenz. And for the support of setting up this event, I would first of all like to thank the MeDiMi Research and Activism Group, which Mina and I are also part of, and that is aiming to entangle academic formats with approaches from political practice. And furthermore, I would like to thank Dora Pindus, Maxim Kruschwitz, Hassan Turi on the camera, and of course, Professor Susanne Barketsistel. And most of all, the speakers we invited on this panel today, Tareq Alaows, who's today online and who will actually also make his contributions in German and be translated by Susanne Barketsistel, Mariana Karkoutly, Hannah El-Hitami, and Monika Borgmann. Thank you for being with us today and discussing. Before we start, just a few words that I cannot avoid saying. We are all aware that this event is taking place today in troubled times. The current war on Gaza and the attacks of Hamas have led to deep disruptions also here in Germany, and many events have been cancelled lately, even those tackling other parts of the Middle East. It seemed as if it has become almost impossible these days to come together in our various backgrounds and together with the diasporas from the region to talk and discuss and analyze and also mourn together about what's happening. It would somehow feel weird to just ignore that also on this panel there are some people directly or indirectly affected by the recent violence. And since this is an event about Syrian diaspora, it would also feel weird to ignore that many Syrians I spoke to lately have been expressing deep feelings of fear and also confusion lately about the current developments in Germany. I'm speaking of people who just fled from war and dictatorship and came here to seek refuge in Germany. I just want to say, I really hope that we can manage to keep talking with this diaspora despite all. And I so deeply believe that in the necessity and the political potential of understanding each other and each other's experiences and perspective. I have been working with this diaspora for so many years now, And beyond everything, it's a deep concern of mine that the Syrian activists that have been struggling so much throughout the last decade can't find a home in this society. I hope, despite all, we manage to have a fruitful discussion today, and I welcome you all to Shades of Justice, Syrian Diaspora, Anti-Normalization Struggle, and Lessons from Koblenz. And now I leave this mic back to the moderator. Wait a second, I will make sure that Tareq can hear us. Can you hear us, Tareq? Can you hear us, Tareq?
Of course, and I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, and you can see us well, right? Okay, thanks. And apologies for the technical issues. Actually, what we are trying to do today is to have like online translation on like live on Facebook, on social media, is one of our critiques of the Koblenz trials that we are also investigating today. So we can see maybe they didn't want to get into the hassle of the technical problems, and that's why they didn't care about translating. Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Susanna, for letting me today to moderate the discussion. My name is Mina Ibrahim. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies and also associate researcher in Susanna's team in the MeDiMi project. I would love to welcome you all again to our event. Let me briefly introduce our speakers for today, and then we'll start our questions. And I hope really it will be, as Maria said, a good opportunity to keep talking and keep our discussions. So our first speaker for today from the middle, Hannah El-Hitami, she's a German Egyptian freelance journalist based in Berlin. Her work focuses on the Arab world, migration, and international law. She followed the El-Khatib Koblenz trials, like in Koblenz, on more than 100 days in court, and reported about it extensively for Spiegel, Al Jazeera, Taz, Zenit, and others. Since then, she has covered other universal jurisdiction trials in Germany concerning Syria and recently Gambia. Hannah is also currently a journalist in residence at the Max Planck Institute for International Law in Heidelberg. Welcome, Hannah. And our second speaker from the online virtual world, Tareq Alaows, who has been active on rights of refugees for various organizations, such as for ProAsyl on the topic of migration. And on the topic of migration and refugee politics, he works as a spokesman and consultant for campaigns and networking. Tareq was about to become the first Syrian refugee to run for the 2021 federal election with the Green Party as a candidate for the Oberhausen and Dinslaken. At the end of March 21, Alaows announced to withdraw from his candidacy because of threats he faced. And then Mariana Karkoutly, who joined us today, and she recently actually also joined our MeDiMi project. So Mariana served as a co-founder and the legal investigator at Huquqyat, an organization compromising self-identifying women, lawyers, and legal practitioners engaged in legal accountability in Syria. Her role involves actively contributing to the development of case files concerning war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. In addition to her roles, Mariana is also a board member at both Huquqyat and GIM, Guardians of Equality Movement. She holds a bachelor degree in law from Damascus University and 2 masters in the field of social science and social work that she both did in Berlin universities. She recently became a PhD fellow in the MeDiMi project, as I mentioned, focusing on the name of our the long name of our project, Human Rights, Crimes, Law, Entrepreneurs, and the Implementation of the Principle of Universal Jurisdiction in Germany. One day I should memorize the name of our project. And last but not least, my actually manager at the MENA Present Forum. So I'm having really the pleasure to introduce her for the first time in a talk. Monika Borgmann, she's a German-Lebanese journalist, award-winning documentary filmmaker and archivist. As one of her documentaries, she co-directed the movie Tadmor, one of the biggest torture prisons by the Syrian regime, together with her husband, late husband Borgmann, who was assassinated in 2021. She co-founded as well with Borgmann the UMAM documentation and research that deals with the issues of civil violence and war memories in Lebanon. She is an activist against what she described as Lebanon's culture of impunity and dealing with the past, countering official amnesia about the Lebanese civil war. In 2018, I had the pleasure actually to working with her in her a project that she co-founded also with Borgmann, the MENA Prison Forum, an interdisciplinary regional project that traces cultures and histories of incarceration, torture, and trauma, which actually extend Monika's and Borgmann's work on memory in Syria and Lebanon. Thanks again for joining us today, and hope it will be nice. So as Mariana, as Maria mentioned, our event for today, it's an event that we are trying to think with you about the Koblenz tribes. So that's why we are hosting today 4 people who have been dealing in different ways with the Koblenz tribes, either activists, journalists, and archivists as well. So I will start with Mariana, and first question to you. And you have been also involved with German, in the German civil society during the Koblenz tribes in general. So for you, how the Koblenz tribes happened, and what was the political vision behind it for you?
Thank you, Mina. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mina. I'm a bit sick today, so you will hear a lot of coughing. I'm sorry for that in advance. I was doing at the time my legal training at the ECCHR when Koblenz trial was being investigated and was taking place in Berlin. Just to give a short overview of the case, on February 2019, 2 state officials, Anwar R., who was a member of the Syrian General Intelligence Service, and Iyad A., was a part of security unit, which arrested many activists and put them in detention centers, were arrested in Germany for committing crimes against humanity. And the investigation started happening, evidence started being collected. At the time, Anwar R., actually, after him going to the German police and saying that he was afraid that he's being followed by certain members of the Syrian regime, there was the time when an investigation was opened in him, and then Iyad A., who was giving his testimony to the authorities at the time as an asylum seeker refugee, also triggered the investigation on that. Also, to give a short background, German authorities were the first in Europe at the time to initiate a structural investigation related to Syria. In 2017, German prosecutors interviewed 200 witnesses in 2 structural investigations related to Syria. The first investigation was launched in September 2011 and covered crimes committed by various parties involved in the Syrian conflict. And the second investigation, initiated in August 2014, focused on crimes committed by ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, with an emphasis on the ISIS attacks on the Yazidi minority in Sinjar, Iraq, August 2014. Why this is important? Because basically Germany has been already doing a structural investigation in detention facilities in Syria, and when Anwar R. Iyad A. were there, this was not news for the authorities at the time. They had already collected some data backed up by civil society, or the Syrian civil society organizations, but also the ECCHR, the European Center for Constitution and Human Rights. A lot of victims and witnesses at the time as well came forward, who were residing in different European countries, and they also spoke about their experiences and joined the case. In Koblenz, also in February 2019, the Federal Court of Justice issued 2 arrest warrants against the accused, and both of them 5 days later were arrested. Why was it important for Syrians at the time? I've discussed, at the time I was working on a master thesis, and what was interesting for me is this very concept of justice and how it's being created within Syrians' minds after Koblenz, but also during Koblenz. What were the questions that Syrians were asking themselves? Some very, very small amount of Syrians, not all Syrians. I did not have access to people who are in Syria or in neighboring countries who would have a very different approach to the whole concept and how they were experiencing it. But one of the main importance, I would argue, of such a trial was the narrative creation within the court itself, within the judgment itself, the ruling saying that detention did not start with Al-Khatib trial. It did not start in 2011. The practice has been used by the Syrian regime for long and long years before that to oppress people in Syria, or to oppress political activists, people, or anyone who would basically criticize the Syrian regime. The juridical system was co-opted by the Syrian regime, as a lot of other systems within the country, to follow its own agenda. And it also brought a lot of questions to how do we as Syrians then perceive justice after all of the injustices that happened even before 2011, but also 2011 onward. I think this kind of narrative created within the court, but also outside the courtroom, was particularly very important for Syrians to start discussing this concept in reality, to be able to have an opportunity to seek a certain justice form, certain form of justice that is apart from their country, using their universal jurisdiction, that is super limited, and we're going to discuss this later today in the event, not using any the juridical system in their country, neither any international tools, yet starting the conversation, asking these questions. And I think this is the particularity, for me at least, from what I was seeing of the Koblenz trial.
Thanks, Mariana. Thanks a lot. Okay, Hannah, like as we mentioned while introducing you, have been reporting the Koblenz trials as a journalist from within the trials. So, what were your observations, and how did the Syrians within the diaspora, or even within Syria, perceive the trials as well?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here, seeing that I also studied in this very center for 5 years, and I'm also happy to see some people that I met in Koblenz and spent a lot of time with. I think it's a bit difficult to summarize observations from almost 2 years of trial, like being in the courtroom, going back and forth between Berlin and Koblenz almost every week. It started with at the same time that the pandemic started, so it was a really interesting and different kind of time. I think to maybe what I would like to talk about, because this is what kind of stays with me the most from those 2 years, is my personal the development of my personal view of the trial, because I think in the beginning I shared the same kind of view that I read in a lot of different media outlets that I also kind of produced as a journalist in the beginning, which was very almost euphoric and like, okay, finally justice for Syrians. And I feel like a lot of media, and I'm not necessarily criticizing this too much, but it's just something I later became aware of. A lot of media outlets kind of reproduce the same stories, talk to the same people. And yeah, and then when you spend more time there, not just the opening day and not just the most gruesome testimonies, but you actually go there every week. I think that's when you start seeing some cracks in this nice story of justice, finally justice for Syrians, because it's, yeah, obviously not that easy, not that simple. So I think the first thing that I observed that kind of ruined that great image was the more and more witnesses who were afraid about their relatives in Syria, and they kind of like were on the witness stand, had to make a testimony. In Germany, of course, if you're summoned as a witness, you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the whole truth, so you can't just be like, I don't want to repeat what I said to the police. You have to. And many of them were not allowed to be anonymous. Many of them had said something to the asylum, in their asylum talks introduced, and then were referred to the federal police, and then from there to the court. And I noticed that many of them somehow didn't really understand how fast everything happened, and suddenly they were in court, and they were like, they had to make a testimony, worried about their families. You know, this was. And then the judge is saying, well, you have to make a statement. We can't not ask you. This was the moment where I was like, okay,
there is a problem, and then other problems came up. I mean, this is something that can definitely be argued about, but the selection of defendants, at least with EAD, who was a very low-ranking officer who defected, I would say maybe as soon as he could, but I'm sure there's different opinions on that, and I don't want to say that he's innocent at all, but I noticed also within the Syrian diaspora, the people that I talked to, that there was some disagreement about, you know, is this really the right guy? And then also when he was convicted, even in the judgment, there was a lot of talk about what was really important for the Syrians that I knew, the fact that all of this was crimes against humanity, or were crimes against humanity. But this guy didn't really, didn't feel like anyone really cared about him. There were even some people who were like, well, you know, he's not, like people who actually knew him personally. I saw a lot of connections even between the activist families and the defendant's family. And yeah, so that was another issue. And over the time, more and more questions come up, and at some point, and of course the whole question, which I think we're going to discuss later, the whole question of accessibility of this trial for Syrians, which should be, I think, the main priority, because otherwise, what are you doing this for? Who are you doing it for? Why are you doing that? Why are you making the effort if you're not going to allow survivors and victims communities to participate? So yeah, so for me, I think that the journey was from very positive, very optimistic, very happy, to very critical, and this doesn't mean to discredit the whole concept or the whole file. I think it means to criticize it because, like, hoping that it could be better in the future, and it seems that universal jurisdiction is getting more and more common. So what could we do if we keep criticizing it? What could we maybe improve so that next time mistakes won't be repeated? And your second question, like, how did Syrians receive it? I think, first of all, I think Mariana will talk more about this later and has done much more research on that. I think I can only say what I know from the people that I talked to during the trial. And I think a lot of what I just said also comes from my conversations with Syrians. Of course, there were different camps, there were different people with different priorities in the trial. I think it's very important to note that not all the Syrian diaspora is like celebrating the trial. There's more critical voices. There's the ones who are pushing it more. I remember reading the MENA Prison Forum testimonies 2 years ago from people, I think, who were even maybe in Syria. Some of them said, this trial means nothing to me because it's in Germany, I have nothing, like I don't have any access to it. So I think that was very mixed. But of course, I also met the people who were part of this trial, like the joint plaintiffs, the victims, survivors, who saw the whole trial as something of a therapy and a way of, you know, regaining the control over what had happened to them. So I think that's also really important to notice, but also to notice the critical parts of it.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so the third question for Tareq, can you hear me well? All is good, okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, so Tareq, while the world, like while the Koblenz trials were taking place, Germany lifted the ban on the deportations to Syria. You got professionally involved with migration politics in Germany by this time, and also faced like a racist campaign that we also mentioned while introducing you. How can these developments be understood in conjunction, like between the trials and these policies, and how would you connect the question of migration politics and the Syrian cause to the question of justice for Syrians? Okay.
Und Tareq, wir sprechen zusammen, ich übersetze dich. Kannst du in
Alles gut, ich brauchst du nicht zusammen. Ich würde nur auf Deutsch sprechen, aber damit ja. Erstmal, leider kann ich nicht bei euch vor Ort sein, aufgrund der jetzigen politischen Entwicklungen hier in Berlin mit 2 Gesetzesentwürfen, mit massiven Verschärfungen im Bereich Flucht und Migration hier im Bundestag, die wahrscheinlich diese Woche noch beschlossen würden. Und eine große Entscheidung, die auf europäischer Ebene steht und die damit verbundenen politischen Termine hier. Deswegen könnte ich leider nicht vor Ort sein. Ich wäre gerne vor Ort dabei gewesen. Also, MENA, ich sehe die Situation auch ein bisschen anders. Also es ist nicht nur die Aufhebung der allgemeinen Abschiebeverbot nach Syrien, sondern eher die konkreten Bestrebungen Horst Seehofers, um Menschen nach Syrien abzuschieben. Also es gab konkrete Pläne, die ersten Charterflüge oder Flüge aus Deutschland nach Syrien abzuschieben und die damit auch verbundene Zusammenarbeit in diesem Fall. Also sollte es zu so einer Abschiebung nach Syrien kommen, dann bedeutet das auf jeden Fall, dass eine Zusammenarbeit mit dem Assad-Regime auf einer diplomatischen Ebene stattfinden soll, um diese Abschiebung umzusetzen. Für mich zeigt das, es ist auf jeden Fall eine Frage der Handlung. Und vor allem der Haltung der deutschen Politik in Bezug auf die Migrationspolitik und auch die Frage der Haltung auch in Bezug auf den Menschen aus Syrien, also was das bedeutet, Gerechtigkeit überhaupt. Und ich sehe in meiner Betrachtung die Frage der Gerechtigkeit nicht nur mit Koblenz Verfahren, was auf jeden Fall ein sehr wichtiger Teil in der Frage der Gerechtigkeit ist, sondern auch mit dem Schutz für Menschen aus Syrien. Und wenn ich das mit dieser Haltung aus der deutschen Politik verbinde oder zusammenstelle, dann sehe ich die Entwicklungen in den deutschen Gesetzen in den letzten 8 Jahren. Und damit meine ich die Änderung im Asylgesetz und Aufenthaltsgesetz, was dazu geführt hat, dass nicht alle SucherInnen den vollständigen Schutz in Deutschland oder was wir als Flüchtlingseigenschaft benennen, sondern eher den subsidiären Schutz bekommen könnten nach dem zweiten Asylpaket im Jahr 2016 und die damit verbundene Verzögerung mit der Frage der Familienzusammenführung für die syrischen Familien. Und da sehe ich eine große Widersprüchlichkeit. Also auf die eine Seite würden hier Verfahren durch Verbrechern, also Regimeverbrechern in Deutschland durchgeführt. Auf der anderen Seite wird diese Frage der Schutz durch der deutschen Politik nicht ernst genommen. Und wie gesagt, also sogar nach dem Urteil in Koblenz gab es die Bestrebungen von Horst Seehofer weiter, die Menschen abzuschieben. Von daher, da sehe ich, dass die deutsche Politik einfach die ganzen Verfahren, die hier durchgeführt wurden, beziehungsweise all die Mühen, die zivilgesellschaftlich gemacht wurden, sowohl durch die Community als auch die Organisationen, die das Verfahren begleitet haben und investigativ mit dabei waren, nicht ernst genommen, ehrlich gesagt. Und natürlich, also du hast auf der anderen Seite hast du das Thema so rassistische Anfeindungen damals, die ich persönlich hatte, die ich auch mit dieser deutschen Politik immer verbinde. Je mehr die deutsche Politik Verschärfungen im Bereich Flucht und Migration durchführt, je mehr Debatten mit rechtspopulistischen Aussagen in der deutschen Öffentlichkeit über Geflüchtete und Migrantinnen durchgeführt würden, bedeutet das dann für betroffene Menschen mehr Angriffe durch Rechtsextremistinnen. Das erleben wir auch im letzten Jahr und in diesem Jahr noch massiv. Die Statistiken über die Angriffe an Geflüchtete in ihren Unterkünften sind massiv hochgestiegen. Deswegen sehe ich das auch in dieser Verbindung, also in Bezug auch auf die Erfahrungen, die ich selbst erlebt habe, als eine sozusagen Zielscheibe für die Community. Also und vor allem dieser Hass, also weil dieser Hass vor allem nicht nach meiner Person gerichtet war, also es war in der Öffentlichkeit gegen mich, aber das spiegelt einfach dieser ganze Hass gegen geflüchtete Menschen, die wir gerade auch gesellschaftlich wieder erleben, die auch damit verbunden, wie die Politik hier in Deutschland durchgeführt wurde. Ja, ich hoffe, ich habe alle deine Fragen beantwortet.
Yeah,
No, that's why I wanted to intervene, that he needs to talk in short sentences, so I can actually do it later, because I can't
Maybe you can summarize for me now.
Sorry, darling, I'm trying, this will be very hard, because I didn't even take notes. I think Tareq's main concern is that, but I think everybody here speaks German, it's just people. Okay, so the main I think Tareq's main concern is that he seems to recognize some form of double standards in terms of dealing with the interests and the concerns of Syrian diaspora communities within Germany. On the one hand, there are trials that are being carried out in Koblenz and also now in other places, but on the other hand, asylum processes are, or were at the time when the trial started, not conducted in a way that Tareq wished they had been. He was talking about deportation of Syrians when under the regime of the then Interior Minister Seehofer, and kind of a lack of acknowledgement of the asylum status of Syrian people in Germany, as well as on a more social level and connected to that, an increased discrimination and Russification of Syrian people in Germany, and in particular people who came here to look for asylum. And that he feels is very much out of sync with the efforts to prosecute criminals from Syria with universal jurisdiction, and to contribute to some form of punitive justice. Is that in a nutshell what you said? Yeah, all right.
Zusammengefasst auf jeden Fall.
Okay, thanks, Tareq, and thanks, Susanna. Okay, the first question for Monika. So, while the trials were taking place, you were in Beirut, working for UMAM documentation research and also the MENA Prison Forum. What have you been working on during that time, during the Koblenz trials? And what were your observations from inside Lebanon, especially, of course, with the big Syrian community living there? And how did your work in Lebanon that mainly raises the question of memory work from Diaspora respond to the trials? How can you connect trials to Lebanon, Syria, and your work about that?
Thank you, Nina. First, I'm very glad that this event is happening, because we had been planning to launch the MENA Prison Forum in Berlin in the end of November. I mean, last week, almost 10 days ago, we had a program of 3 days with a special focus on Syria. But due to what was happening in Gaza, we decided to postpone to next year. So I'm glad that you're holding and you didn't postpone. It's the first thing I want to say. Then, yeah, I mean, as Mina said before, the question of culture of impunity, the question of accountability has been always in the center of our work. Is it UMAM documentation or also in the MENA Prison Forum? The MENA Prison Forum is an initiative of UMAM, which we launched in Berlin in 2018, and where Mina joined immediately. And so, of course, I mean, Lebanon is also a country which never saw accountability after a civil war of 15 years. So we are very sensitive to this question. And when the Koblenz trial started, we were extremely glad that finally there is an effort to give accountability to Syrians. And we tried to follow as much as we could. And this became, in Beirut, very difficult. Actually, we followed only through the reports by the ICCHR. And then we followed a podcast, which was the branch 251, the Koblenz trial done by Fritz Streif and his team. So very often we listened to Hannah when she came from the courthouse, and these were really our two sources. And it was extremely sad that the trial happened only in German. There was no translation into Arabic, and which provoked also a huge frustration in the Syrian community in Lebanon, and it was a frustration for everybody, including us. So yeah, we tried as much as we could to follow. We knew also some of the persons who gave their testimony, as we have been working for years very closely with diverse Syrian organizations.
And we got, over the time, over the months, we got more and more engaged with the MENA Prison Forum. We also co-produced some of the season one of the MENA of the Koblenz trial, and we finally produced these books here, one in English and one in Arabic. And for us, it was, again, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but it was a very important starting point, because we know in Lebanon very much how important it is to break the culture of impunity. And I would just like to give one example. In August 2020, there was a huge explosion which destroyed half of the city of Beirut. And today there is a second judge who cannot do anything. And I will not go here into all the Lebanese details, but it seems nothing can be done concerning accountability for the port explosion in Beirut. So the only hope is to find justice outside Beirut. There have been several calls to have a UN fact-finding mission. I don't know if this will ever happen, if such a mission will ever see really the light of the day. There have been a series of political assassinations since the independence of Lebanon. There have been more than 200 political assassinations since 1943. It's a very small country, Lebanon, so it's quite a lot. There has almost never been accountability. The only effort for accountability in Lebanon was a special tribunal for Lebanon for the assassination of Rafik Hariri in 2005. This tribunal lasted years. It costed millions. And finally, one person was convicted, and it was said he is close to Hezbollah. And but I mean, it was a trial in absentia. So it was also not the most happiest experience. And unfortunately, in our countries, is it Syria, is it Lebanon? It seems we need to count on Europe, on the international community to find justice. I understand all the criticism Hannah was mentioning before concerning the tribunal, but as Anwar was convicted for crimes against humanity, I hope in the future, and I really hope that this can be an argument to forbid the normalization with the Assad regime.
Now we are like getting from your own kind of positionality connected to the trials to maybe what actually you did, right? So we'll get more into even the Impossible Stage podcast. That's one of my favorite projects for the Independent Forum. So I will start with Hannah, this like second round of questions. Like as we were talking, right, the Branch to Fight one, so you have been contributing to it, and so what was the meaning of contributing to this podcast, especially that it was produced both in English and Arabic? And again, it kind of course, tried to solve a bit about this problem of translation that we also covered in the first round of the questions. So yeah, so what was the Branch to Fight podcast and what did it mean to you?
Yeah, well, I stumbled upon the podcast just when it was still beginning, because I met Fritz in the courtroom, the person who initiated the podcast. But at the beginning it was just in English, and I think from the second season it was in English and in Arabic. So yeah, I'm half Egyptian, but I'm not like native Arabic speaker. So think maybe it was also kind of amusing then to listen to me summarize the trial in Arabic, but also in English. But of course, yeah, the content was hardly ever amusing, but I was glad that I was able to, you know, every once in a while in 2-3 minutes summaries, bring some information from inside the courtroom to, well, whoever was listening. Honestly, I don't know the statistics of who was listening. I think there were also people from Syria perhaps following. And yeah, it was really important because, I mean, not just the podcast, any kind of reporting in English and Arabic was the only way to bring any information from the courtroom to the people who are most concerned by it. And there were several well, individuals and organizations who tried to bring the court to allow journalists or anyone from the public to follow the trial in Arabic, because of course there was an Arabic live live translation, yeah, interpretation, because there was it was translated for the defendants who were listening to it in Arabic. So there was already translators in the courtroom, and there were the headsets available, but they were just not. Nobody was allowed to use them. So it was just a waste of perfectly, you know, great translation that could have been used by a lot of people. And then it kept being, so people kept pushing for the translation to be made accessible, and the court kept denying that. They argued, I remember the funniest argument that I remember was court language is German, so that's why, you know, it's not going to be accessible in any other language. At some point they did allow journalists who were accredited and had a special interest because of their background, maybe Syrian journalists, to get access to the translation. But this was actually also for nothing, because in order to be an accredited journalist, you would have had to get accredited in March 2020, so before the trial even started. But how could you have known about the trial in German? How could you have known about the accreditation? All the press communication was only in German. So at that point, there was, I think, maybe two individuals who could have made use of this translation. But yeah, anyway, I'm just saying, like, altogether, it was, I as a journalist, or many of us often felt that the court is actually doing its best not to make the trial more accessible, especially language-wise. So in the end, it was only NGOs like the ECCHR, journalists like me, and then other journalists like Luna Watfa, Syrian journalists, who kept going and, you know, spreading the word from inside the courtroom. And what I found really interesting, I'm not going to get deeper into that, but I was recently following a trial concerning crimes against humanity in Gambia, and I talked to an activist from Gambia, and she said, you know, the problem is that the Syrians, they have this big diaspora community in Germany. They are quite established here, but Gambians, most of them come irregularly. Most of them are fearing deportation. Gambians are one of the most deported migrant group from Germany. So they didn't even have those activists and funding to send people to the courtroom and get all the translation for the people concerned. So yeah, it shouldn't also be the job of the diaspora and activist community to finance a translation. It should be done by the court, and also it should be done by the court because then the court can ensure that, I mean, I'm not saying anyone didn't report the truth and the facts, but still it should be the job of the court, which is let's say completely unbiased and has no personal stake, to just transfer the information to the outside and not force people to find funding somewhere and do it or get it done somehow. But in the end, well, we did get it done somehow, so I'm glad that those podcasts and that existed. But yeah, and there is a change of law of the Strafprozessordnung supposedly happening that would make it easier with the translation, and also perhaps with recording of trials in the future, but it's not sure yet, but I think it's on its way.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. And the second question is for Mariana this time. Like you did research and you wrote as well on how different voices within the Syrian diaspora perceive the trials and how It might lead to negotiations on how to understand justice in the Syrian case and for the Syrian people. Can you tell us a bit more about this, and what did you find out during your research, and what would be a concept of justice for Syrians beyond the front?
Yes, so thank you, Nina. As I've mentioned before, the research that I've worked on is not in any way representative of all Syrian voices. I've spoke to only the people who were mainly activists either before the revolution or during the revolution, or were part of the case itself. So the realizations that I'm going to talk about now are also very, very, very specific to this group, but also if we do the same interviews today, maybe with the same group, there might be changed answers, especially in the current situation, I would say. Before, I spoke to 10 people. They were from different generations, but also genders. Before the court started, some of the questions that were coming up was, who is being trialed? We want to look at high-ranking officials, as Anna was saying. We do not consider putting an effort in looking at Anwar Al or EFA is something that we need to be concerned of, while other voices were more arguing, especially in a lot of cases, legal activist voices were arguing to the fact that victims of these two perpetrators deserve to have a room in which they are being heard and listened, and they actually deserve to have this court happening. So there were those two arguments, but then there was the argument of Anwar R changing his political affiliation, for example. This was also before. Would that then lead to the fact that we do not have to get him trialed? How would then Syrians, if this court trial was happening in Syria, would look at someone like Anwar R? Would they want him to be trialed or not? Same goes with Iyad, also as Hannah was explaining. The other discussion was also about victims' hierarchy and accessibility to legal tools. A lot of people, all the witnesses and survivors who were at the Koblenz trial were based in different countries that they had legal access to, while, for instance, people who live in neighboring countries to Syria or inside Syria would not have accessibility to this legal tool because governments since 2015-16 are hesitant to relocate people from these countries, meaning that even if you were a very, very important victim or witness to the case, you might very well not be relocated, meaning that they cannot keep you safe, prosecution authorities or war crime units, and then you will not be heard. So this is again why it's not very relevant to a lot of Syrians in neighboring countries or inside Syria, such a case happening, because they're not being involved in it. And also they have everyday injustices to look at and to kind of find that is different from something that is related to international core crimes that happened 10 years ago. Another part that happened during the trial, the language, as Hannah was saying, I'm not going to repeat, just going to follow up on that. When we were together in Wafa LD case, for example, later in Berlin, what we've realized, and I think you agree with me, is that Syrians did not show up because Koblenz happened, there is no translation, and I cannot understand the word. I've seen groups from Families for Freedom, Caesar Families Association taking their stuff and going all the way to Koblenz, 8 hours or 9 hours away from the cities they're residing in, entering the court and not understanding a word. And then feeling that this is not for me then, the trial is not for me. And then what the LD case happens, it's also on certain group of Syrians from Yarmouk who also don't have a lot of advocacy groups around. And then you see the court empty. We have there was no one coming there. So it's also kind of driving Syrians more afar from these cases. And then this is changing, hopefully. Then again, with victims protection, of course, also during the trial, to which extent there is a victims protection programs. We see now in cases like in Frankfurt, that came also after a Koblenz trial, Alaows, a lot of victims and witnesses are being threatened. Their family members are being threatened inside the country. And there is how can you challenge that? Especially that the UJ in court challenges impunity. This is the point of it. So this is also something that came up a lot when it came to Koblenz in the beginning. Then after that, questions on deportation, when a witness comes forward and gives their statement, then political situation changed in a certain European country, and then this person is deported. How? I mean, are they going to go to the same country that is ruled by a war criminal in that sense? Then came the questions on enforced disappearance. The court at the time refused to look at the case of enforced disappearance for two reasons, mainly because it's difficult to prove the intent of the person who did not tell you the whereabouts about your family members as you were asking, and two, even in the case, so this is in the case where a person would actually go to a detention facility and ask about one's family member, which in a lot of cases also people would not go because they're afraid that they would be detained themselves. So the court refused to look at it, which is contextually in relation to Syria very problematic because it has a certain kind of context to it. And then sexual and gender-based violence, where the court decided to take off certain witness statements to sexual and gender-based violence because they were not yes, they were not connected basically. And then the court did not take under consideration the mental element of people who actually experience sexual and gender-based violence, and also the duration, the time period in which the violation happened or the crime happens, and then you're getting a trial, which is sometimes 10 years later. I think all of those kind of discussions that happen between Syrians inside the courtroom, so as the court is happening, but also outside, and then challenging and discussing these points has led to what Hannah was also referring to with language, but also with sexual and gender-based violence and enforced disappearance, to changes that we see currently hopefully are happening within the German law in relation to these four crimes. And that's why I think it was important for such a participation to happen. Had it happened on a higher level, we would have seen also higher changes happening and more changes happening. So yeah, those are the results.
Thank you. Mariana, I will just build on what you said about the everyday injustice. I really like this term, and I will go to Monika because you, in your work, have been trying to investigate and work on the everyday injustice in Syria, actually through the Tadmor film that you co-directed with Luqman Salim in 2016, and as well, as I mentioned, also the Possible Stage podcast that was produced, kind of, the idea started actually at the same time of the Koblenz strikes. So how these, like, for you, like, how these artistic confrontations actually have an effect on former detainees, and where might be similarities or differences to testimonies in the courtroom for witnesses themselves, like for the witnesses or for these artistic confrontations, how they can build or how they are connected also to the trials happened in Koblenz, and what impact might this have on their understanding of justice both in Syria and Lebanon as well?
Well, let me start to say some words about Tadmor. Tadmor is a film which we made with a group of former detainees, Lebanese detainees, who were kidnapped during the Lebanese civil war and spent all between 8 and 15 years each of them in Syrian prisons. And we have been, as UMAM, we have been working on the disappeared in Lebanon, and this group of men, or let's say Lebanese who disappeared in Syria, they are part of the border missing people, if you want. So we met in 2008, we met a group of men who were released after the death of Hafez al-Assad. There was an amnesty law, they came back to Lebanon, and as each person is different, some started to talk to the press, others didn't start to talk to the press, but when the revolution started in Syria, they felt they want to together, collectively, give a kind of testimony. So the film, I mean, when you do a film, you have to find a kind of visual form, and these men we followed these men, because sometimes words were not enough really to describe the horror they had been going through. And when they didn't find words, they started to reenact. So the film is partially interviews and partially a kind of reenactment what they have been going through. And it was what you were talking about therapy, that witnessing in a courtroom can be a kind of therapy. I would also say that testifying in a film can be kind of therapy, and also taking the it was also an act of giving the voice to all these who have no voice because they were detained, still detained, and all that, independently or not important if they were Lebanese or Syrians. So this group of men of Tatmor, they understood themselves as a kind of porte-parole really for all those who cannot talk. And well, I was a former journalist, and I started to do what I'm doing now, and I believe that art can play a major role. It cannot replace justice, but it has the potential to attract a larger audience. And in this sense, for us, it was important to make this film Tatmor. In this sense, the arts became also a part of the MENA Present Forum, because really we are dealing with difficult topics, and sometimes through the arts you can find a way how to make them more accessible for everybody. And in this sense, again, I would say also the podcast, The Impossible Stage, was born. It was done by a Syrian former detainee, Jabba Bakr, who worked very closely with MENA on these podcasts. And yeah, I invite you to listen to them. They're online on our website. I will not talk now too much about this, but it's really trying, I would say, it's trying to find forms to reach out to a larger public, and art can translate the horror in something you can absorb in a way. And second, sometimes really art or films, they replace also a certain kind of justice. I will talk for 1 second about our first film. Our first film was a film called Massacre. It's with 6 perpetrators of the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, which happened in 1982. No justice was given. We managed to find at the time 6 perpetrators who committed the massacre and made this film. And what I know from survivors of this massacre, that even if they didn't get the legal justice, they found a certain justice, that their testimonies were confirmed by the perpetrators. So justice is also something subjective, I would say. Today you have, as I mentioned, you have the disappeared in Lebanon. We are talking about 17,000. Families gave up of asking for legal justice. They are only asking today for the right to know. Maybe these kind of calls or the perception what is justice for a person can also change with time. I think it's very subjective. But on a personal level, I'm really convinced what can save this whole region is only real legal justice.
Thanks, Monika. And the last question from my side, and Tareq, if I may excuse you, like to answer this time in short sentences, so that not to take notes. and to be able to also for our like online stream or like dear audience on Facebook. You were also active in the campaign Defend Assad, which mainly criticized the cooperation of the German administration with the Syrian embassy as a matter of normalization politics. Like, can you tell us a little more about this, and where do you see the connection also to the justice question?
Ja, ich versuche auch langsam zu sprechen, dann wäre das besser für die Notizen. Es geht tatsächlich bei der Frage um der Frage der Passbeschaffungspflicht für geflüchtete Menschen. Jeder Person im Asylverfahren hat eine gesetzliche Pflicht, die in die Richtung geht, dass die Person Reisepass von ihrem Herkunftsland vorliegen soll bei den deutschen Behörden. Bei den Menschenauszügen gab es eine Ausnahme aus dieser Pflicht, die in die Richtung ging. Diese Menschen sind hier im Asylverfahren anerkannt. Sie kamen aus dem Kriegsgebiet mit einem Regime, mit einem Folterregime, und deswegen sind sie ausgenommen, bis Horst Seehofer diese Entscheidung geändert hat. Und zwar zum Teil der syrischen Community. Ja.
So the topic Tareq is talking about is Syrian refugees come to Germany from an authoritarian regime. Whilst being in Germany, the issue might come up that then you require new passport documents. And the general practice is when you are abroad and you need a passport, you have to go to your embassy in order to file for a new passport. For Syrian refugees who fled the Assad regime, going to an embassy was not really an option because they feared that they would be arrested there.
Naja, es geht nicht nur um die, geht nicht nur um die Verhaftung, sondern auch die Bedrohung gegen den Familien von diesen Menschen im Herkunftsland, weil ja das Regime in der Botschaft Informationen aus den Familien oder von den Familien sammelt. Und es gab tatsächlich auch Vorfälle, in denen Menschen in Syrien bedroht wurden, dadurch, dass oder bekannt wurde, dass ihre Familienangehörige hier in Deutschland Asylanträge gestellt haben und durch diese Passbeschaffungspflicht in der Botschaft, in der syrischen Botschaft gezwungen wurden.
So it was not just about being arrested in the Syrian embassy, but also Syrian authorities knowing about the whereabouts of particular people, which would then put the life of their families back home in Syria at risk because Syrian government would learn that they were actually in Germany as refugees. Then Seehofer changed the law.
Ja, es gab genau diese Änderung vom Bundesinnenministerium in den Zeiten von Horst Seehofer, der dann durch einen Erlass vom Bundesinnenministerium diese Ausnahme für SyrerInnen aufgehoben. Das bedeutet, nach dieser Entscheidung 2018 von Horst Seehofer ist zum großen Teil viele Menschen aus der syrischen Community oder zum großen Teil viele Menschen, die subsidiären Schutz in Deutschland haben, vor allem aus der syrischen Community, gezwungen wurden, durch die Praxis in den Ausländerbehörden zu der syrischen Botschaft zu gehen, um Reisepässe zu beantragen und sie vorzulegen. Davon ist auch der andere Teil aus der syrischen Community betroffen, indem sie ihren Status wechseln wollen. Und zwar die Menschen, die im Asylverfahren diese Pflicht nicht haben, aber dann irgendwann eingebürgert werden wollen, müssen dann zur syrischen Botschaft gehen, um einen Reisepass zu beantragen und zu besorgen und das bei den deutschen Behörden vorzulegen.
So in 2018, Seehofer, the then Minister of the Interior, changed the law and lifted the opportunity for Syrians in Germany, Syrian refugees in Germany, to go to the embassy, meaning that they actually had to go to the embassy or had no longer the option not to go to the embassy in order to get their documentation. Now, this caused problems. Partly they needed documentation in their asylum processes, but also for Syrians in Germany who wanted to assume German citizenship, they required documentation, which they then had to get from the embassy, putting them into situations where they eventually actually had to go to the embassy to get a passport in order to get German citizenship. of fight for justice.
Ja. Ja. Und da sieht man auch anhand diesem Beispiel wieder, dass die Haltung in der deutschen Migration, also Asyl- und Migrationspolitik, ist viel wichtiger als Fragen wie Gerechtigkeit für die deutsche Politik. Weil, wie gesagt, die Frage der Gerechtigkeit ist nicht nur Verfahren wie Koblenz Verfahren, ist ein Teil. Also Koblenz Verfahren ist ein sehr wichtiger Teil in der Frage der Gerechtigkeit. Aber da sehen wir einfach der Frage des Schutzes von Menschen und ihrer Familienangehörige, die da in diesem Fall ignoriert durch die deutsche Politik, in der Menschen gezwungen wurden, in die syrische Botschaft zu gehen.
So the question of justice in Germany, Tareq argues, should not be reduced to punitive justice, legal justice in courts, but it's also a form of justice that resides in, or one component is that also people are protected by the state in Germany, they and their family. So to him, this is a kind of a broader conception of justice, where this protection by Germany of people who are here because they claim asylum is of relevance. And he argues that this applies to the German asylum and migration politics.
Ja. Und auf der anderen Seite ist auch nicht Frage von Schutz, sondern auch Ignoranz durch die deutsche Politik, weil wenn Menschen in die Botschaft gezwungen würden, dann müssen diese Personen, um einen syrischen Reisepass zu haben, höhere Beiträge auch bezahlen oder höhere Beträge bezahlen, zwischen 250 € bis zu manchmal über 1000 € pro Reisepass pro Person bei der syrischen Botschaft. Und die andere Frage ist, wie viele Gelder kriegt die syrische Botschaft durch diese Praxis. Wir haben versucht, bei der Kampagne Defend Assad diese Gelder zu kalkulieren und kamen auf den Zahl, über 100 Millionen € jährlich fließen aus der syrischen Botschaft in Berlin in den Krieg in Syrien, weil ja die Botschaft diese ganzen Gelder nach Syrien zum Regime überweist. Und dann würden Menschen gezwungen, per deutschen Gesetze Assads Kriegs gegen die Bevölkerung, gegen ihre eigenen Familienmitglieder und Freunde in Syrien mitzufinanzieren, nur weil nur weil die deutsche Politik ihre Praxis nicht ändern möchte. Trotz der klaren, ja.
There's other element to the passport issue. When Syrians go to the embassy in order to get a new passport, they have to pay between 250 and partly more than 1,000 euros just to obtain a passport. This leads to kind of the German embassy in Berlin acquiring enormous funds, very large funds. There's an organization that's called Defend Assad, and they calculated that per year, per annum, the Berlin embassy collects about 100,000 euros just in fees from passports. So in a kind of very twisted way, people living in Germany and reflect the Assad regime contribute with their payment for passport and documentation to funding the war in Syria.
Ja, tatsächlich 100 Millionen.
100 millions?
Und auf der anderen Seite, also wir haben in der letzten Frage über das Thema Abschiebung gesprochen. Also bereits am letzten Freitag gab es schon die Ankündigung vom deutschen Innenministerinnenkonferenz, dass jetzt ein Auftrag aus dieser Konferenz auf das Bundesinnenministerium ging. Und zwar ist ein Rufauftrag, um zu prüfen, ob Abschiebungen für bestimmte Gruppen von den syrischen Geflüchteten, aber auch die afghanischen Geflüchteten rein rechtlich möglich wäre. Und da sehe ich wieder, also nicht nur durch CEPAS und die ehemalige Regierung, sondern auch durch die andere Regierung. Jetzt sehe ich schon die Bestrebungen, diese Frage der Abschiebung einzugehen. Also sehr wichtig ist es noch nicht entschieden, aber es gab diese Rufauftrag. Das heißt, das Bundesinnenministerium wird jetzt mit diesem Auftrag überprüfen, ob Abschiebung von sogenannten GefährderInnen mit dieser ganzen Problematik, diesem Begriff, weil es nicht gesetzlich definiert ist, ob man GefährderInnen und aus Syrien und aus Afghanistan abschieben kann. Und da sieht man wieder nochmal, dass die Haltung der deutschen Politik, und zwar die Abschottungspolitik, viel wichtiger im Bereich Flucht und Migration als die Frage von Gerechtigkeit, auch wenn das bedeutet, dass Menschen in einen Folterstaat abgeschoben würden oder in einen Unterdrückungsstaat wie Afghanistan abgeschoben würden sollen.
So last week there was a conference, a meeting of the federal interior ministers and imperial ministers of the federal states of Germany, where they decided to ask the National Federal Ministry to investigate whether it's feasible to deport people from Syria and Afghanistan if they are listed as gefährdet. I don't know what gefährdet is in English.
Dangerous.
Dangerous? They're just dangerous?
Yeah.
Well, people who are considered to be a threat to German security. So it's a technical term. So the investigation is whether they should be, even though Syria and Afghanistan are countries where there is still torture and oppression, whether people who are a threat to German national security should be deported to these countries. And Tareq emphasizes that in that he sees a certain kind of closing of borders and closing kind of like borders also in metaphorical sense, Abschottung, in Germany that kind of contradicts notions of justice towards people from Syria in Germany.
Ja, also die Problematik mit dem Begriff Gefährder geht einfach, oder lautet, dass es keine genauere rechtliche Definition für diesen Begriff gibt und dass es nur aufgrund eines Verdachtes eine Ausweisungsinteresse liegen kann, also bei dieser Frage. Das heißt, wir sprechen hier nicht unbedingt über StraftäterInnen und auch sollte es mit der Frage der Straftaten gehen, dann sprechen wir nicht unbedingt über so terroristische Anschläge, wie es suggeriert wird von der deutschen Politik, sondern wir sprechen über kleine wiederholte Straftaten, vielleicht so 3-mal über rote Ampel laufen und Recht zu haben, dass die Polizei einen 3-mal erwischt. Dann kann die Person als Straftäter eingestuft werden. Also, ja.
The challenge with the terminology, the word gefährder, threat to national security, is that it's not defined and it's not in itself a legal term. It does not necessarily relate to criminals or people who are about to plan a terrorist attack, but also smaller deeds, smaller crimes, when they accumulate, can lead to being listed, like petty crime, can lead to being listed as a threat to national security, and then these people can be potentially deported to Syria or Afghanistan.
So yeah, it's time that I stop talking and like to open also the floor for like our dear audience. If you have questions, and I would like to keep maybe that we have like 20-25 minutes of us questions. So to keep the questions short, and I might need also to repeat the question again because also for the online translation, so that to appear on the microphone. So sorry, like our wireless microphone doesn't work, so I have to repeat it again. And instead of you coming here, so maybe I will quickly repeat it.
I have a question about the normalization towards the Assad regime today. How does that look like? What are the developments in this when it comes to that from the German perspective? Actually,
thank you so much for this fantastic panel and also for addressing this topic, which is obviously very important, and as is the work you're doing. I was just wondering, because what you we all know the kind of prospects for justice, or even like transitional justice, even talking about justice in the broader sense, are pretty bleak right now, and you've already pointed to how important it is to then do something outside. And Monika, you also spoke about kind of the role arts can play in that, and it's something other researchers have also worked on, also for the Syrian context, like what can literature do, these kind of things. So I was just wondering, maybe also more specifically for the German context, what role can civil society or the Syrian community itself maybe play in keeping on struggling for justice in the legal sense, or for transitional justice in the classic sense, but also maybe for just creating spaces where justice can be envisioned or enacted in other kind of ways outside these kind of spheres. So if you could just share a bit about that, I'd be really, really interested in that.
You can have a third question.
My question, could Mariana answer it? My question goes kind of like since 2 years ago, we're on like so many courts, and like in France, Netherlands, and Canada, they're like doing such a processes against the Assad regime, and they're working with the Syrian civil society on a national level. But my question is, they have kind of a fundamental homogeneous goal on doing on it, or is it kind of like France is doing its stuff, Germany doing it, and like in the Netherlands they have such another heterogeneous goal?
So yeah, now we have like very quickly 3 questions. The first about normalization. The second is about the relation, like how Syrian civil society can act actually to keep like track of justice and calling for justice. And the third is about like the Syrian trials happening also around the world. Actually, this was a backup question that in case we have time that I would have asked the text, so thanks. Yeah, so I don't know who would like to, maybe you can start with Mariana, the direct question, and then maybe we can see who would like to answer maybe the 3 questions.
I'm just going to address shortly the question from Pierre, because if I understood correctly, the question is on German civil society.
Also beyond this, but also for the German context, because I know very little about that specifically.
Yes, because to me, today, the German civil society can do a lot when it comes to the questions of justice. If we look at justice in its multidisciplinary context, if we look at it from different angles, if we look at everyday injustices that migrants face, refugee camps, if we look at what cases get to be opened, what cases do not get to be opened, I think here German civil society has a huge role to play to keep the role going when it comes to the universal jurisdiction. Because, and then going back to the question there, basically the universal jurisdiction is a legal tool that is related to the local context in the country that it's applied for. So basically in Germany, we have unlimited universal jurisdiction, right? We can trial any person committing a crime against any victim in any country, if this is an international war crime against humanity and genocide. While, for example, in the Netherlands, the priority would be to a criminal or perpetrator who is in the land of the Netherlands. If the perpetrator is not in the Netherlands, the case is not going to be open. So there is no structural investigations in the Netherlands. That said, my argument is that there are then cases that do not get to be opened in those different countries because of the limitation of the universal jurisdiction. In addition to that, the universal jurisdiction is not completely independent from the politics of the country, which is supposed to be in the case of these countries, but it's not, because certain cases to be opened has a certain political weight. And this political weight is not for each country, not each country is okay to take over this big weight. I remember when I started doing my legal training, I started working on Iraq, crimes that were committed between 2002 2004. Americans and the UK personals are never going to be trialed for the crimes that they committed in Iraq. So there's this kind of political weight to the crime. And then what crime are we looking at? I've been working with my colleagues since 2020, for example, on the crime of siege and starvation of the civilian population in Syria, in the south of Damascus, between 2013-2014. A crime that has been happening historically in different contexts in the world, in different countries, a lot, and has never been investigated, or a court hearing has been opened in, where South Sudan has faced it, Yemen, Mariupol in Ukraine, and today, as we speak, Gaza. And we don't see this crime being investigated, we don't see it being opened. And then who are the perpetrators is also a question. And I think this is the strategy that is different from one country to another towards the cases they look at. A, in relation to political will, B, in relation to the regulations that basically regulate the UJ within this particular country. And this is what I think citizens can push forward to more acknowledgement to crimes that are not being acknowledged and looking at perpetrators that are not being looked at.
So, I don't know, Monika and Tareq, if you have any inputs on the question?
I just would like to add something. I'm not sure that, I think also Germany has a limit that you cannot have a trial in absentia. And so in this sense, I don't know to which extent is there cooperation, and I can maybe talk better about the port explosion of 2020 in Beirut. I mean, as the investigation of a judge called Bitar was completely blocked, several human rights organizations, for example, they also reached out to the international community, and they started, for example, to launch a tribunal in Texas because 9 of the victims had the double nationality. Now they are doing the same with Lebanese who have the French nationality. It's somehow searching where on the international level you have the opportunity to do something. And yeah, this is what I would like to add. It's
Anata, you have the answer to the normalization question, and Hannah, maybe you can say something about them.
Ja. Ich wollte die Frage auf jeden Fall beantworten. Ich habe die Frage aber an sich leider nicht gehört, aber ich kann es so ein bisschen einschätzen, in welche Richtung die Frage geht.
Yeah, it's mainly about,
Maybe just have a more detailed.
yeah, about the
Normalization with Assad.
Also wenn die Person vor Ort nicht ins Mikro spricht, dann kann ich es gar nicht hören. Von daher, ja. Trotzdem, also
I mean the current situation with the normalization issue in Germany.
Ja, gut. Ja. Also natürlich, wenn es entschieden wird, dass Menschen nach Syrien abgeschoben würden, bedeutet das auf jeden Fall Zusammenarbeit auf einer diplomatischen Ebene. Und das bedeutet erstmal Anerkennung und Normalisierung des syrischen Regimes hier durch die deutsche Politik. Weil man kann Menschen nicht in einem Land abschieben oder in einem Drittland abschieben, während sie aus Syrien kommen. Deswegen ist die Frage mit der Türkei und Libanon komplett ausgeschlossen. Die Abschiebungen sollen aus Deutschland direkt nach Syrien stattfinden.
So one important aspect when it comes to normalization is again the question of deportation and deporting Syrian refugees from Germany to Syria would require diplomatic relationships between Germany and Syria, because you cannot just deport people from Germany to Syria without engaging with Syrian authorities.
Ja, das bedeutet auch vielleicht auch auf einer anderen Seite die Wiederaufnahme der syrischen oder der deutschen Botschaft in Syrien, damit diese Zusammenarbeit aufrechterhalten wurde. Das heißt, es gibt auch keine Schrittnormalisierung, es gibt in diesem Fall die volle Anerkennung vom syrischen Regime und die komplette Normalisierung und die diplomatischen Beziehungen mit dem syrischen Regime, wenn es darum geht.
This would most likely also involve reopening the German embassy in Syria, which I understand is closed, and that would mean launching right back into kind of full 100% diplomatic relations between Syria and Germany.
Und auf der anderen Seite sehe ich auch eine indirekte Normalisierung vom syrischen Regime durch die deutsche Politik. Dadurch, dass so viele Gelder durch die Passbeschaffungspflicht aus der syrischen Botschaft in Berlin zum Regime fließen können. Was auch im Widerspruch zu den Grundsätzen, was die deutsche Politik sich auf der anderen Seite vorgenommen hat, in Bezug auf die syrische Politik und die Nichtanerkennung vom syrischen Regime.
More indirectly, they already mentioned issue of paying for passports in Syrian embassies is a way of normalization through the back door because it kind of recognizes Syria in a way and kind of offends the basic principles of Germany to not enter into any diplomatic relationships with Syria.
Do you want to add anything to the questions?
It's not a direct response to any of the questions, but it kind of something referring to what you both said, I think. Something that's really been on my mind, and I'm not sure what the answer to this question is. On the one side, you said that there's a political decision behind every trial that's opened, and especially the ones that are not opened. And I've been reading a lot about how universal jurisdiction has been restricted a lot in several European countries over the past 20 years, especially through pressure by the United States. And then on the other hand, you have, if I understood you correctly, you also referred to like, okay, there has to be a search for any legal avenue outside of the country, anything you can get. And I think these are the two kind of opposing arguments. And for me, I'm almost at the point where I feel like if you only take whatever you can get, it might erode the whole concept of justice or international justice as such, because you will end up only having specific politically allowed, politically accepted trials. And then a lot of people in the world, a lot of regions and communities might end up saying, you know what, this is a very limited, very biased, very double standard kind of justice. So it's, we're not going to respect it anymore. We're not going to refer to it anymore. But I think a big risk, and at the same time understand the idea to say whatever we can get, if we can't get it in the country, we'll get it wherever we can go. So yeah, that's just something that came to my mind and talking about what you both said.
Can I just add one thing? I just would like to add one sentence. I mean, I understand fully what you are saying, but I gave the example of the port explosion, and even if it's fragmented, there is more and more evidence coming together, and this evidence can then also later be used. So this is where I see a kind of advantage in this approach.
Okay, we can have a second round of questions. Already have Emma, Natalie, right? And Hani as well. We'll skip the German class today to join me. Thanks with me in safe German.
My question is if there are any efforts in Germany, like by the state or by local, like by city, to have like a different, like to go outside of the court for justice, like to try other means of transitional justice. Yeah, that was my question.
In Germany.
Yes, in Germany.
Yeah. So the first question from Emma, like the efforts to go out, like outside the courtroom, actually to call for justice, right? Yeah. Second question.
Thank you so much for your interesting talk. I'm very curious about your point of view. You're already talking about the changing of the German Strafprozessordnung. From your point of view, what is necessary to create justice, and also from a not legal perspective, what do we need? And I want to make a legal argument, not to lose hope in human rights. At first, I totally see the connection between the changes about the subsidiary protection, because in 2016 there was a change of the family reunification. So I see this connection, but just to deport someone to a country, there is no difference between some Gefährder or anyone else. So I think just to keep in mind, the exclusion clauses from protection status are, in my point of view, not so easy to fulfill, like you were talking about. So I think it's important to keep in mind, and that it is forbidden to deport a person to a country in which his or her human rights will be violated, and also Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And I think in this case, it's important to criticize that politicals are talking like that right now, but I think there's a next step. So I think that won't hopefully, but it's our task.
So that's our comment, right?
Here's a comment and a question first.
Okay, can you just maybe just sorry.
I asked what would be necessary in your point of view for the change of the German Strafprozessordnung to create justice, and also not from an own legal perspective, because we were talking about arts and so on. Thank you so much, everybody.
Monika is asking what would be necessary to change the German Strafprozessordnung, right? And yeah, it's fine now. Yeah, so it's yeah, so and then she's and then what? So yeah, what would be necessary? The necessary tools, right? Yeah. And third question from Monika.
So the question is, it links to the first question that was asked previously, like more specifically, how would the anti-normalization struggle basically help the people who are still under the Assad regime? This is the question. Also, a further comment that links to the question. I think they didn't want the trial because they don't have electricity. So that's perhaps an explanation. And also, Anwar Aslan, in any case, isn't a high-ranking officer, basically. He was only head of department, so no one in Syria heard about him or knows his name. This is the comment.
So yeah, so I guess the point, how the anti-normalization efforts can be connected to the people living in Syria now. And he's also making a comment that no one followed the trial because actually there's no electricity, and Anwar is actually, yeah, he's not known actually, unlike that actually the big people who should be. So maybe then we can. Do you have any final questions? Maybe any final comments? So we'll take the answers and then we go in peace. Monika,
you know more what is happening in Germany than me.
I mean, I could maybe say something to your question about what would have to change. I mean, what is most probably changing is the language issue, although I'm not sure how comprehensively it's going to change. I don't think anyone who goes into the court will be able to access translation. I think it's still going to be restricted to journalists. I think there will probably be recording, but also not accessible to anyone. So it's not going to be like the International Criminal Court where you can just watch it all online. And there's a good and a bad side to it, because there's the argument of victim protection, which I think is not completely out of it. Like, it does make sense. I don't know how many people would feel comfortable with, testifying in court, which is live streamed on the internet, especially in such cases where there already is a threat to witnesses. But yeah, it's going to be a little bit better accessible. And well, I think the problem is asking for more. Like I just said, like everything has its ups and downs. So I don't know if it would be better if it was all accessible online. I think one of the most important things that has changed is what we were just talking about, like just the equality of it. Like if you open that case, you better also open that other case and don't just focus on one country and always on the same countries. And also the question that you mentioned, the kind of the hierarchy of witnesses and victims. I think borders make these trials very difficult. The fact that certain people cannot even come to testify or be an official Nebenkläger, so like have rights as a victim in a court because they're not allowed to enter the country. In the Gambia trial, it was actually quite interesting. The defense got some witnesses from Gambia, and then both of them ended up applying for asylum here. And then, of course, you're not sure if they came only for that reason, or did they actually have some information to share? So I think, yeah, just borders make these trials very difficult because they're supposed to be cross-border, but they're not, but they're very restricted by it. So, and of course, yeah, we're not gonna abolish borders like this year, but I think I'm just saying, like, yeah, it's hard to say like the specific things that could change, but it's just some thoughts that I had on that question.
Can I just add what I think is very important to allow trials in absentia?
I will also add that basically every court, every case that opens brings with it questions on what needs to be changed. So with the case with the Koblenz, we had sexual and gender-based violence, and then we had the enforced disappearance, right? And then with every case that comes in, it's new questions comes in, and then the law would change in accordance to those questions. So this is where the optimism might come, and I share it with you, and I hope that it will also be the case for future, especially with political changes in Germany at the moment. With the question on transitional justice, the very concept of transitional justice is a concept that is applied in a country after a war situation. In that sense, after it transitions from a certain political system to another political system. So basically, certain processes in abroad can happen to lay the ground for a certain transitional justice to happen in the country, the war-torn country, but the transitional justice itself cannot occur in another country. It has to occur in the country in which the transition is happening. So I would argue that those cases are very, very valuable and helpful because of that sense, because of laying this ground. And then on Syria, I would agree with you on the electricity matter with the everyday injustices, absolutely. But then I would say Anwar R was known for the people he tortured and who were in court. And this is important. And I think that keeping this in mind always, there was a whole argument in relation to Koblenz, Hannah touched base on it, that the Koblenz trial was being presented as if it's going to bring justice to Syria. Khalas, we're going to have this trial and then we have justice to Syria, which is not true. And it's also not realistic expectations. A court hearing to people cannot bring justice to Syria. This is not possible, but it can bring a certain feeling of justice for those who were tortured under this person. So this would be my argument.
Tareq, if you have any inputs, no, okay.
No, thank you, I'm good.
Hope you are all good. Okay, just one final remark, like recently together with my colleagues at the project and also Tora and Mariam also sitting also there. Like we have been carrying our interns with the MeDiMi project, we have been starting to carry out what we call Marburg study. So it is actually based on life stories with Syrians living in Hessen, but we call it just because we are living in Marburg, so we call it Marburg study. So really, so if you have like, so Syrians in the room or like friends who have Syrian friends or like want to get involved with us, like it's a based on life stories, like interviews that can really contribute. So we place the Koblenz trials into people's life stories, and that's actually into people's life history. So we don't just take it, we don't just ask people about what is your opinion about this, but it's actually based on a life story project. So if you have any recommendations for me, just you can find maybe my email address on the page of the event. So please approach me at any point. One more time, thanks Maria a lot for the introduction and the remark. Thanks to you who helped us. So thanks Tora, Susanna, and Hassan actually who helped us with the translation, helped us with the setting up and the recording. Thanks a lot. And finally, thanks Mariana, Hannah, Monika, and Tareq for joining us today. And we hope really that this will not be the last talk, and long live the Syrian revolution. Thanks a lot.